The first ray of morning sun was just beginning to peek over the snow-capped edges of the eastern mountains when an old, rust-eaten prison gate creaked open with a grinding sound that seemed to echo the agony of centuries. From within emerged a gust of mixed odors, humidity, iron, blood, and something else that couldn't be named but felt like the very essence of despair, as if this gate had been imprisoning not just bodies, but the souls of the forgotten for decades. A thin, dark-complexioned man in torn old clothes, with disheveled hair, slowly stepped through the threshold. His movements were deliberate, yet cautious, like someone who understood that every step forward was a step deeper into hell. Nobody recognized him. In everyone's eyes, he was just another ordinary thief, another nameless face in the endless parade of the condemned. But the reality was far deeper, far more dangerous than anyone could imagine. This person was actually Ibrahim Traore, the president of Burkina Faso, a man who had exchanged the comfort of presidential palaces for the horror of a forgotten prison. At this moment, he had neither his uniform with its gleaming medals, nor protective guards with their watchful eyes, nor the glitter of media cameras that usually followed his every move. He had stripped himself of every symbol of power, every mark of authority. He had only one mission burning in his heart: to see the real face of those sanitized reports that claimed Murden Prison was completely organized, humane, and rehabilitative. He knew from years of experience that truth written from the safety of government offices often hides the torment that festers within stone walls and iron bars. The two white guards at the door looked him up and down with the kind of contempt reserved for insects. Their eyes held no recognition of his humanity, only the cold calculation of predators sizing up their prey. "Move faster, damn you! We don't have all day for your kind," one guard snarled, his voice dripping with years of practiced cruelty, and pushed him inside with unnecessary force. The shove sent Ibrahim stumbling forward, but he caught himself without complaint. Ibrahim lowered his head in submission, playing his role perfectly. He gave no response that might betray his true identity or mission. He knew that the success of this dangerous gamble lay entirely in his ability to remain silent, invisible, just another broken soul in a sea of the forgotten. Upon entering the main compound, another guard, this one younger but with eyes already dead from years of witnessing suffering, handed him an old, dirty prison uniform stained with what looked like blood and mud. The fabric was coarse and reeked of previous occupants' fear and desperation. Along with it came a blanket that had clearly seen better decades, one that reeked of decay and rusted iron, its original color long since lost to neglect and misery. His new home was Cell Block C, a designation that carried special meaning within these walls. This was the place where only black prisoners were sent, specifically those who had committed the triple crime of being poor, dark-skinned, and friendless. Those who had no lawyer to speak for them, no relatives with influence to pull strings, and no newspaper willing to raise their voice for justice. The walk to the cell was a journey through circles of hell that Dante had never imagined. The corridors were lined with other cells, each one a pocket of human misery. Through the bars, Ibrahim glimpsed faces that had long since given up hope, eyes that stared without seeing, hands that no longer reached toward light. When he finally reached his designated cell, it was immediately apparent that humanity had breathed its last breath here long ago. The walls were broken and cracked, with dark stains that could have been anything, but probably weren't anything good. Dirty water pooled on the uneven concrete floor, creating small lakes that reflected nothing but despair. A dim yellow bulb hung from the ceiling like a dying star, flickering weakly as if it might surrender to darkness at any moment. Instead of proper beds, there were rust-covered iron frames that looked like medieval torture devices, topped with torn mattresses whose cotton stuffing protruded like the guts of some disemboweled creature. The stuffing was gray and moldy, and Ibrahim wondered how many men had died on these same mattresses, their final breaths mixing with the stench of decay. A few prisoners sitting in the corner were watching him intently, their eyes holding the calculating gaze of survivors who had learned to gauge how many days it would take for this new man to break and crumble. They had seen it all before: the initial defiance, the gradual breakdown, the final surrender to the system that ground men into dust. Ibrahim chose a corner and began surveying his surroundings with the trained eye of someone who had spent years studying human nature and institutional failures. On one side, two prisoners were whispering quietly to each other in voices barely above a breath, perhaps discussing some old failed escape attempt, were sharing fragments of memories from the world outside these walls. Their conversation was punctuated by nervous glances toward the door, as if even whispers might bring punishment. On the other side, an elderly man with silver threading through his hair and profound sadness carved into the lines of his face lay half-stretched on the cold floor. His breathing was shallow and labored, and Ibrahim could see that malnutrition had taken its toll. He would later learn that his name was Bar, and that he had once been a respected teacher in his village before a false accusation had landed him here to rot. As soon as he entered the cell, another guard made a mocking comment that cut through the heavy air like a blade. "Welcome to the monkey cage, boys. Fresh meat for the grinder." The other guards laughed, not the hearty laughter of genuine amusement, but the hollow, echoing laughter of men who had forgotten what joy felt like and substituted cruelty instead. Ibrahim absorbed this statement into his heart like a sponge soaking up poison, but showed no reaction on his face. Years of diplomatic training had taught him to maintain composure under the most extreme circumstances. He knew that every word, every attitude, every calculated humiliation was evidence for this mission, evidence that would eventually see the light of day and bring justice to these forgotten souls. As evening fell like a funeral shroud, the prison atmosphere became even more terrifying. The temperature dropped, and with it came sounds that seemed to emerge from the deepest circles of hell. The sound of chains clanking could be heard from somewhere far away, metal against stone, as if someone was being dragged away for punishment that existed beyond the bounds of human decency.
Barred window, but it carried no scent of freedom, only old decay, human waste, and the accumulated despair of decades. Before cell block C's heavy door closed for the night, with a finality that seemed to seal them away from all hope, another prisoner was pushed inside. His face was swollen from recent beatings, purple and black bruises mapping out a geography of violence across his features. He fell straight to the ground and groaned, a sound that seemed to come from his very soul, but not a single person moved to help him up. Here, everyone had learned the bitter lesson that survival meant focusing only on your own pain. Compassion was a luxury that could get you killed. In that moment, as Ibrahim watched this broken man struggle to find a position that didn't cause agony, he said to himself with quiet determination, "This place doesn't just break bodies. It systematically destroys souls, crushes spirits, and murders hope." But he made a sacred vow that night that he would preserve every injustice, every cruelty, every violation of human dignity in his memory, no matter how much humiliation and suffering he would have to endure. As night deepened and the prison settled into its rhythm of quiet horror, the other prisoners gradually fell into the fitful sleep of the traumatized. But Ibrahim remained awake, his senses alert to every sound, every nuance of this hellish symphony. The rustling of rats on the ceiling created a percussion section of tiny claws on metal and wood. Coughing from cells beyond the wall provided a bass note of human suffering. Someone's muffled screams from the distance, whether from nightmares or ongoing torture, he couldn't tell, added a soprano line of pure anguish to the composition. He closed his eyes in the darkness, trying to find some small corner of peace in his mind, but sleep would not come. His thoughts were too full of what he had already seen, too heavy with the weight of what he knew was still to come. He understood with crystalline clarity that this was just the beginning, that the first gentle notes of what would become a symphony of horror, the real story, the story that would shake his nation and change everything, was about to begin. In the distance, a church bell chimed midnight, its sound somehow managing to penetrate the thick walls of the prison. But instead of offering comfort or hope, it seemed to mark another day in hell, another rotation of the earth that brought no relief to the suffering souls trapped within these walls. Dawn came, not with hope, but with the harsh clanging of metal on metal as guards struck the bars with their batons, a sound that served as both alarm clock and warning. Prisoners stirred slowly, their movements stiff with cold and the accumulated ache of sleeping on surfaces designed to punish rather than rest. The morning ritual began with the same systematic dehumanization that characterized every aspect of life in Murden Prison. It was feeding time, and prisoners shuffled into lines in the prison courtyard like cattle being led to slaughter. Winter fog had rolled in from the mountains, blurring the edges of the world and creating an otherworldly atmosphere that seemed appropriate for the hell they inhabited. But one thing cut through the fog with absolute terrifying clarity. This line was divided into two distinct parts, as if humanity itself had been split down the middle by an invisible blade of racism and cruelty. On the left side of the courtyard, white prisoners stood in clean uniforms that actually fit their bodies properly. They chatted to each other with light smiles playing on their faces, discussing topics that ranged from sports to memories of the outside world. Their conversations carried the easy confidence of people who knew they would be fed properly, treated with basic human dignity, and possibly even released someday with their health and sanity intact. But on the right side, in stark and deliberate contrast, black prisoners stood in torn old clothes that hung off their bodies like rags on scarecrows. The fabric was stained with things that spoke of neglect and abuse. Fear lived in their eyes like a permanent resident, and the shadows of hunger had carved hollow spaces in their faces, making their cheekbones sharp and their eyes appear sunken into their skulls. Ibrahim, who was still being identified by everyone around him as Jones Dia, a name he had chosen to honor a friend who had died fighting for justice, stood in the line of black prisoners. His eyes were fixed on the large kitchen door ahead, where guards were bringing out food containers with the casual efficiency of people who had performed this ritual of discrimination thousands of times. For white prisoners, the treatment was almost civilized. Separate tables with clean surfaces, spotless bowls that gleamed in the morning light, steaming soup that actually smelled like food rather than refuse, boiled eggs that were still warm, and fresh bread that had been baked sometime in the recent past rather than weeks ago. But when the turn of black prisoners came, the entire scene transformed, as if a switch had been flipped from human to animal. In a large rust-covered pot that looked like it hadn't been properly cleaned since the prison was built, there sat a liquid that could generously be called broth. It contained rotten vegetable matter with moldy leaves floating on the surface like dead fish in a polluted pond. The smell that rose from this concoction was so foul that it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on anyone unfortunate enough to breathe it. Along with this soup came a bowl containing what might have once been rice, but had since transformed into something that resembled wet concrete. Mixed in were fragments of what appeared to be chicken bones, but given their state of decay and the green tinge they had acquired, they probably had been several days or weeks old when they were first added to the pot. The water situation was perhaps the most deliberately cruel aspect of the entire feeding ritual. While white prisoners received clean water in glasses that had actually been washed, black prisoners were given liquid from the same containers used to wash the prison's animal cages, stinking yellow water covered with a film of algae that moved sluggishly on the surface like some primitive life form trying to escape its toxic environment. As Ibrahim watched this systematic dehumanization unfold before his eyes, he noticed a thin young man standing in line just ahead of him. This was Khalid, barely 19 years old, who had been caught the previous week on charges of petty theft, stealing bread to feed his younger siblings while their mother lay dying in a hospital bed they couldn't afford.
His face showed the flush of fever, bright red patches on his dark skin that spoke of infection taking hold in his weakened body. His hands trembled not just from cold, but from whatever illness was coursing through his system. When Khalid's turn came, he stepped forward hesitantly and said in a voice so quiet it was barely audible, "Sir, please, could I have some warm water? I have a fever and I'm very cold." Headguard Marshall, a heavy-set, bald white man whose very presence seemed to radiate malevolence, looked at Khalid with eyes that held not even a trace of human compassion. Marshall's hatred wasn't just personal, it was institutional, systematic, the kind of hatred that had been refined over generations of oppression. He remained silent for a long moment, savoring Khalid's vulnerability like a fine wine, then allowed a devilish smile to spread across his face like oil over water. "Warm water," he said, his voice dripping with mock surprise and genuine pleasure at the opportunity to inflict cruelty. "Warm water, you say?" He began to laugh, a sound that had no joy in it, only the hollow echo of a soul that had long since died. "Warm water is for humans, boy. For animals like you, there's only that water we use to wash the pig pens and dog cages." Saying this with theatrical flourish, as if he were performing for an audience of fellow sadists, Marshall filled a cup from the contaminated jug and placed it in front of Khalid with exaggerated ceremony. The smell that rose from the cup was so overwhelming that Khalid involuntarily turned his face away even before his trembling hands could grasp it. The liquid inside was not just dirty, it was actively hostile to human life. The guards standing nearby began laughing with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for genuinely funny entertainment, as if witnessing a young man's dehumanization was the highlight of their day. For them, this wasn't cruelty, it was just another morning at work, another small pleasure in their routine of systematic oppression. Ibrahim watched all of this unfold with the intense focus of a man documenting atrocities for history. His hands were clenched into fists so tightly that his fingernails drew blood from his palms, but no trace of his inner turmoil showed on his face. Years of diplomatic training had taught him to maintain perfect composure, even when witnessing the worst of human nature. He repeated to himself like a mantra, "If I speak up now, if I break character for even a moment, the mission will end here. These people will never get justice, and nothing will change." After the feeding ritual, though calling it feeding was perhaps too generous a term for this systematic poisoning, the prisoners were herded back toward their respective cell blocks. On this walk, Ibrahim witnessed another scene that carved itself into his heart with the precision of a surgeon's blade. A white prisoner, walking casually and comfortably after his adequate meal, approached one of the guards with the easy confidence of someone who expected to be treated as a human being. "Hey, could I get a cigarette?" he asked, his tone suggesting that this was a reasonable request between equals. The guard smiled, actually smiled, with what appeared to be genuine friendliness, reached into his pocket and extracted a cigarette from a fresh pack. "Sure thing," he said, even offering to light it for the prisoner. "Take your time with it." A few steps behind this scene of casual humanity, when a black prisoner, an older man whose crime had been stealing medicine for his dying grandson, made the same request, in even more respectful tone, the response was swift and brutal. The same guard who had been smiling moments before immediately struck the man across the face with his baton, the sound of wood meeting flesh echoing off the prison walls. "Thieves and vagrants like you don't get cigarettes," the guard snarled, his voice now filled with venom. "You're lucky you get to breathe the same air as decent people." The contradiction was so stark, so deliberately cruel, that Ibrahim felt something break inside his chest, not his resolve, but his faith in the possibility that such systematic evil could exist in a world that also contained beauty and love. Upon reaching cell block C, the elderly prisoner who had been lying on the floor the night before slowly approached Ibrahim with movements that spoke of arthritis, malnutrition, and decades of abuse. His voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper, as if years of shouting for justice had worn it down to almost nothing. "Son, let me tell you something that will save you a lot of pain and false hope. This prison doesn't punish crime, it punishes color. Here you could be a doctor, professor, or general outside these walls, even if you had saved lives or built schools or fought wars for your country. With this skin, your status is no more than a slave. Less than a slave, actually, because slaves were at least valuable to their masters." Ibrahim looked into the elderly man's eyes and saw an ocean of accumulated suffering. Years of imprisonment, decades of systematic dehumanization, and the special kind of helplessness that comes from knowing that the system is rigged and there is no appeal, no higher court, no authority that cares about justice when it comes to people who look like you. These words weren't just the bitter complaint of an old prisoner who had given up hope. Ibrahim realized they were a diagnosis of a sickness that ran deeper than individual cruelty or personal racism. This was institutional, systematic, a machine designed to destroy certain kinds of people while preserving others. That night in the cell, as darkness fell like a lead blanket over the prison, the cold seemed to penetrate not just their bodies, but their souls. The blankets they had been given were so thin they might as well have been made of paper, offering no protection against the mountain air that seeped through every crack in the walls. In the corner farthest from the door, Khalid lay curled in a fetal position, his body shaking with chills that had nothing to do with the temperature. Sweat beaded on his face despite the cold, and his breathing came in short, rapid gasps that suggested his condition was worsening rapidly. Another prisoner, moved by compassion that could have gotten him beaten or worse, called out toward the guard station, "Please, this boy needs medicine. He's burning up with fever." The response came back through the darkness like a curse. "If he's destined to live, we'll see in the morning. Otherwise, there'll be one less mouth to feed and one less animal stinking up the place." The casual cruelty of this response, the reduction of a human life to a question of convenience and feeding costs, hung in the air like poison gas. Ibrahim lay in the darkness, staring up at a ceiling he couldn't see, listening to the symphony of suffering that played every night in this place. Khalid's labored breathing, the old man's wheezing cough, someone else's quiet weeping, the scurrying of rats who lived better than the human inhabitants of this hell. Sleep seemed not just impossible, but somehow inappropriate, as if resting would be a betrayal of all the pain surrounding him. He felt with absolute certainty that this prison was designed to kill souls long before it killed bodies. Here, hope was treated as contraband, and silence wasn't just golden. It was the only currency that could purchase survival. But as he lay there absorbing the full magnitude of the systematic evil he had uncovered, Ibrahim made another vow. Every detail, every cruelty, every violation of human dignity would be remembered, documented, and eventually brought to light. The men who designed this system, who profited from it, who carried it out day after day, they would all face justice. The question was whether he would survive long enough to make that justice a reality. It was the third night in cell block C, and winter's dampness had become a living thing, creeping through every crack in the walls and penetrating to the marrow of every bone. The cold wasn't just uncomfortable, it was aggressive, malevolent, seeking out every weakness in the human body and exploiting it ruthlessly. The dim yellow light of the single bulb continued its epileptic dance, flickering with increasing frequency, as if it too was dying slowly, giving up its fight against the encroaching darkness. The air in the cell had become a toxic soup of human misery, sweat from fever-racked bodies, the metallic smell of blood from untreated wounds, the stench of filth that could never be properly cleaned away, and the omnipresent odor of rusted iron that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. It was the smell of a place where hope came to die. The prisoners lay in their assigned spaces like broken dolls thrown carelessly into a box. Some had their eyes closed, but their twitching faces and rapid breathing suggested that sleep, when it came at all, brought no peace, only nightmares that were often preferable to their waking reality. Others simply stared into the void with eyes that had seen too much and now saw nothing at all, their minds having retreated to some private place where the horror couldn't follow. In this atmosphere of barely contained despair, a faint groan cut through the darkness like a blade. At first, no one paid attention. Groans, whimpers, and cries were so common in Cell Block C that they had become like background music, noticed only when they stopped. But gradually, this particular sound changed, deepened, became something more desperate and urgent. The groan transformed into the sound of breathing that was clearly broken, each intake of air a struggle against some internal damage that was winning the battle. In the far corner of the cell, barely visible in the dying light, lay a thin, dark-skinned prisoner whose name was Abdul. He was approximately 40 years old, although the harsh conditions of the prison had aged him far beyond his years. 2 days ago, guards had beaten him with a savagery that went beyond punishment into the realm of pure sadism, and all because he had misunderstood a question
shouted at him in French, a language he had never had the privilege of learning properly. "What time do we go to the courtyard?" Head guard marshal had asked. But Abdul, exhausted and confused, had heard something else entirely and given the wrong answer. The beating that followed was methodical and thorough. Marshal and two other guards had used batons, boots, and fists to turn Abdul's body into a canvas of bruises and broken bones. His ribs were cracked, possibly broken completely, and every breath since then had been an act of will against overwhelming pain. Since that beating, Abdul had been burning with fever, his body fighting infections that were winning the battle. His requests for medicine had been met with laughter, his pleas for a doctor dismissed with contempt. In the philosophy of Merdin prison, medical care was another privilege reserved for those with the right skin color. Now, on this third night, young Khalid, that same 19-year-old who was fighting his own battle against illness, slowly crawled across the filthy floor toward Abdul. Khalid's own fever had broken somewhat, but his hands still trembled with weakness as he soaked a piece of torn cloth in the small cup of water they were allowed each day. "Brother," Khalid whispered, his voice carrying a tenderness that seemed impossible in such a place. "Be strong, please, just try to drink a little water." He placed the damp cloth on Abdul's burning forehead with the gentleness of a nurse, though he was barely more than a child himself. The contrast was heartbreaking: youth caring for age, the sick tending to the sicker, humanity persisting in a place designed to destroy it. Abdul's eyes fluttered open with tremendous effort. The fever had turned them glassy, unfocused, as if he was looking at something the rest of us couldn't see. His breathing had become so rapid and shallow that each breath seemed to draw the last reserves of strength from his failing body. When he tried to speak, his lips moved, but no sound emerged. His voice had been stolen by whatever infection was consuming him from within. The elderly prisoner, Bar, stood in the corner watching this scene unfold with eyes that held the accumulated sorrow of centuries. His weathered face was a map of all the suffering he had witnessed during his years in this place. But tonight there was something extra in his expression, a recognition that they were about to lose another soul to the machine of systematic murder that was Merdin prison. Bar wanted to help. Every fiber of his being urged him to move forward and offer comfort. But he had learned through bitter experience that here, compassion was often treated as weakness, and weakness was punished with a severity that could break what little spirit a man had left. From his position against the wall, Ibrahim watched the entire scene with an intensity that was almost physical. His hands were clenched so tightly that his nimble fingers had drawn blood from his palms, and fire, a mixture of rage and helplessness that threatened to consume him, burned in his chest. Every instinct screamed at him to reveal his identity, to demand that Abdul receive proper medical care, to use his authority as president to save this dying man. But he forced himself to remain silent, knowing that if he broke character now, not only would his mission fail, but all the evidence he was gathering would be lost. The systematic murder happening in this prison would continue, and thousands more would suffer and die in darkness. So he remained motionless, counting each of Abdul's struggling breaths like a death watch, committing every detail to memory so that someday, somehow, justice might be served. At exactly 3 a.m., a time that would forever be burned into Ibrahim's memory, Abdul's body convulsed once, a violent spasm that seemed to shake every bone in his emaciated frame. Then, suddenly and completely, he became still. His eyes remained fixed upward, toward the ceiling, as if in his final moment he had seen some light that was invisible to everyone else, some glimpse of the peace
that had been denied to him in life. After one long, rattling breath that seemed to echo off the walls like a final prayer, his chest fell silent forever. The sudden absence of his labored breathing created a vacuum that seemed to suck all sound from the cell, leaving only the kind of silence that follows a great tragedy. Khalid's trembling hands continued their gentle ministration for several moments, as if refusing to accept what had just happened. He carefully removed the cloth from Abdul's now cool forehead, his movements slow and reverent, like a priest performing a sacred ritual. "No, no, not yet," he whispered, his voice drowning in tears that he couldn't afford to shed. "Please, brother, not yet." But perhaps the tears had dried up on his first day in this hell, or perhaps the body's capacity for expressing grief had been exhausted by the constant exposure to horror. Either way, not a single drop fell from his eyes, though his entire body shook with the effort of containing his sorrow. 5 minutes later, 5 minutes during which Abdul's spirit seemed to hover in the cell like a presence seeking justice, the iron door creaked open with its familiar grinding sound. A guard entered, rubbing sleep from his eyes, and clearly annoyed at being disturbed during his rest period. He glanced at the corpse with the casual interest someone might show toward a broken piece of furniture. After a long yawn that seemed to emphasize how little this death meant to him, he made his assessment. "Well, looks like he's finally dead. About time. Saves us the cost of feeding him tomorrow." The guard pulled out a dirty, blood-stained blanket that had clearly been used for this purpose many times before. Without ceremony, he wrapped Abdul's body like someone disposing of garbage, making no effort to treat the remains with even basic dignity. Then, with casual brutality that spoke of long practice, he began dragging the body toward the door by its feet. Abdul's head bounced against the uneven floor with each step, leaving a trail of blood and bodily fluids that spread across the concrete. The smell that followed was indescribable. Death, mixed with decay, human waste, and institutional neglect. As the door closed behind the guard and his grisly cargo, Ibrahim knew with absolute certainty that there would be no funeral for Abdul, no marker on any grave, no mention in any official record. He would simply disappear from all documentation, becoming another transferred prisoner in the sanitized reports that made their way to government offices. Abdul's entire existence would be erased, as if he had never lived, never loved, never hoped for something better than the hell where he had died alone and forgotten. When the door clanged shut and locked for the night, the cell fell into a silence that seemed deeper than mere quiet. It was the silence of souls processing trauma, of minds trying to comprehend incomprehensible cruelty, of hearts breaking in ways that could never be fully healed. Khalid sat on the filthy floor, holding his head in both hands, rocking slowly back and forth in a motion that was part grief, part shock, part the body's attempt to comfort itself when no other comfort was available. Elderly Barr, his voice barely above a whisper, spoke the words that had become his philosophy of survival. "Death is a daily routine here, son. We just try to forget to count." But Ibrahim, lying in the darkness with Abdul's final image burned into his retinas, made a vow that resonated in the deepest part of his soul. No one like Abdul would die this way again without consequence. And if they did die, if the machine of systematic murder continued to claim victims, Their names would not be lost in the dust of forgotten graves. Their stories would be told, their suffering would be acknowledged, and those responsible for their deaths would face the full weight of justice, no matter how high their positions or how protected they believed themselves to be. As dawn approached, bringing with it another day in hell, Ibrahim carried Abdul's memory like a sacred flame. The real battle was about to begin, and it would be fought not just for the living, but for all the dead who had been denied even the dignity of being remembered. The day after Abdul's death dawned gray and cold, as if the sky itself was mourning the loss of another forgotten soul. The atmosphere in the prison courtyard carried a weight that seemed to press down on everyone present. Prisoners moved more slowly, guards spoke in lower voices, and even the usual sounds of institutional routine seemed muted and distant. Ibrahim, still maintaining his identity as Jones Dia to everyone around him, found that the scene of Abdul's corpse being dragged away had embedded itself in his mind like shrapnel. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those lifeless fingers trailing along the dirty floor, heard the sound of a human head bouncing against concrete, smelled the mixture of death and institutional neglect that followed the guard out of their cell. The spark of rage that had been building inside him since his first day was no longer just burning. It was becoming an inferno that threatened to consume his carefully maintained facade. Today, he decided with crystalline clarity he wouldn't suppress this fire anymore. The time for silent observation was over. The time for action had arrived. Black prisoners stood in their familiar lines, the exhaustion of sleepless nights and inadequate nutrition etched into every line of their faces. Their eyes carried the haunted look of people who had witnessed too much death, too much suffering, too much systematic cruelty designed to break their spirits as well as their bodies. White prisoners, as always, stood in their separate lines with the easy confidence of people who knew they would be treated as human beings. They chatted among themselves about trivial matters, the weather, memories of better times, speculation about when they might be released. Their biggest concerns were boredom and homesickness, not whether they would survive another night. Food distribution began with its familiar ritual of systematic discrimination. White prisoners received their usual portions of bread that was actually fresh, warm soup that contained recognizable ingredients, and eggs that had been cooked that morning rather than days or weeks ago. Black prisoners received their standard fare of liquid that could charitably be called broth, though it bore more resemblance to the water used to wash animal cages. The rice was stale and mixed with fragments of what might once have been meat, but had since transformed into something that belonged in a biology textbook rather than a food container. Ibrahim took his plate of institutional cruelty and walked directly toward head guard Marshall, who was supervising the distribution with the satisfied air of a man who took genuine pleasure in human suffering. Marshall was spinning his iron baton in his hand like a conductor's baton, as if orchestrating a symphony of degradation. "This food is not fit for humans," Ibrahim said, his voice calm, but carrying a steel core that cut through the morning air like a blade. Marshall stopped spinning his baton and looked at this prisoner who had dared to speak without permission. His eyebrows rose in surprise that quickly transformed into anticipation. Here was entertainment, a break in the routine boredom of systematic oppression. "What did you say, monkey?" Marshall's voice carried amusement, but underneath was something more dangerous. the excitement of a predator who had just spotted prey stupid enough to reveal itself. "I said this food is making prisoners sick and weak," Ibrahim continued, each word chosen with the precision of a man who had spent years in diplomatic negotiations. "Abdul died last night because he received no medical care after you beat him. He died because this place treats human beings like animals." The effect of these words was immediate and electric. The casual chatter of nearby prisoners stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. Guards who had been lazily supervising the food distribution suddenly became alert, their hands moving instinctively toward their weapons. A dangerous gleam appeared in Marshall's eyes, the look of a man who had been given permission to unleash violence and was savoring the anticipation. "You know what it means to ask questions in my prison, boy?" Ibrahim looked straight into those cold, hate-filled eyes and said with quiet determination, "Yes, I know exactly what it means. But someone has to ask them. Someone has to speak for Abdul and all the others who have died in silence." This single sentence seemed to crack something fundamental in Marshall's composure. His face transformed from amused cruelty to pure, undiluted rage. The veins in his neck bulged as blood rushed to his head, and his grip on the baton tightened until his knuckles went white. "You want to be a hero, do you?" Marshall snarled, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "You want to speak for the dead? Well, let me help you join them." Without warning, Marshall's baton came down across Ibrahim's shoulders with enough force to drop a smaller man. The metal struck bone and muscle with a sound like breaking wood, sending shockwaves of pain through Ibrahim's entire body. But the president of Burkina Faso had endured hardships that had forged his body and spirit into something harder than Marshall expected. Ibrahim staggered, but did not fall. More importantly, he did not cry out, did not beg for mercy, did not give Marshall the satisfaction of seeing him break. Instead, he straightened slowly, blood beginning to seep through his torn prison uniform, and looked directly into Marshall's eyes. "Is that the best you can do?" he asked quietly. The other prisoners watched in stunned silence. In their years of imprisonment, none of them had ever seen anyone stand up to Marshall, certainly not after taking a blow that should have sent them to their knees. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Marshall's rage intensified to a level that made him dangerous not just to Ibrahim, but to anyone within reach. "Johnson! Parker!" he screamed to two guards who came running with the eager anticipation of men about to witness or participate in violence. "Take this animal to the hole. Give him some time to think about respect." The hole was what prisoners called the solitary confinement cells in the basement of Murden prison. Windowless concrete boxes, barely large enough for a man to lie down, where the only light came from a crack under the door, and the only sounds were those of your own breathing and heartbeat. As the guards grabbed his arms to drag him away, Ibrahim turned back to look at the other prisoners. What he saw in their eyes was something that hadn't existed before his confrontation with Marshall. A spark of something that might have been hope, or pride, or simply the recognition that one of their number had refused to be completely broken. "Remember Abdul," Ibrahim called out as they dragged him toward the prison's interior. "Remember everyone who has died in this place. Someday their stories will be told." The guards responded by striking him repeatedly with their batons, trying to silence his voice. but his words had already reached their target. The other prisoners stood a little straighter, looked at each other with eyes that held something more than despair. The solitary confinement cell was everything the prisoners' whispered stories had claimed, and worse. The walls were solid concrete, stained with substances that spoke of previous occupants' suffering. The floor was barely wide enough for a man to lie down, and when Ibrahim stretched out his arms, his fingertips could touch both walls simultaneously. There was no bed, no blanket, no comfort of any kind. A small hole in the corner served as both toilet and drain, filling the tiny space with a smell that seemed to cling to the walls like a living thing. The only light came from a thin crack under the heavy metal door, creating a twilight that made it impossible to distinguish between day and night. For the first 24 hours, Ibrahim was given nothing. No food, no water, no human contact except for the sound of footsteps in the corridor outside. The isolation was designed to break a man's spirit by forcing him to confront his own thoughts without distraction, to realize how powerless and forgotten he truly was. But Ibrahim used this time differently than most prisoners. Instead of despair, he felt a clarity that came from knowing his mission was more important than his personal suffering. Every hour of torture he endured was evidence that would someday bring justice not just to Marshall and the guards, but to the entire system that made such places possible. He used the darkness to mentally catalog everything he had witnessed: Abdul's death, the systematic poisoning disguised as feeding, the medical neglect that amounted to murder, the racial segregation that violated every principle of human dignity. Each memory was filed away with the precision of a prosecutor building a case. On the second day, Marshall himself came to visit, flanked by 2 guards carrying flashlights that seemed blindingly bright after so many hours in near darkness. The door clanged open, and Marshall's bulky frame filled the entrance like a mountain blocking out the sun. "How are we feeling now, monkey?" Marshall asked, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Ready to apologize for your disrespect?" Ibrahim looked up at him from where he sat on the concrete floor, his back against the wall. 48 hours without food or water had weakened his body, but his spirit remained unbroken. "I have nothing to apologize for," he said quietly. Marshall's face darkened. "Still playing the tough guy? Let me explain something to you, boy. In here, I am God. I decide who eats and who starves, who lives and who dies, who suffers and who finds relief. And you," he pointed his baton at Ibrahim like a weapon, "you have chosen to suffer." "And you," Ibrahim replied, his voice steady despite his physical weakness, "you have chosen to become a monster. But monsters always face judgment eventually." The guards expected Marshall to explode into violence, but instead he began to laugh, not the hollow laughter they had heard before, but something deeper and more disturbing, the laughter of a man who believed himself untouchable. "Judgment?" Marshall wiped his eyes as if Ibrahim had told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. "From who? The government? They're the ones who pay me to keep animals like you in line. The courts? They sent you here in the first place. God?" He gestured around the concrete hell they were standing in. "If there was a God, would places like this exist?" Marshall leaned down until his face was inches from Ibrahim. His breath smelled of alcohol and decay, and his eyes held the empty coldness of someone who had lost his humanity so long ago that he couldn't remember what it felt like to possess it. "I'm going to leave you here until you forget your own name, until you forget there was ever a world outside these walls, until you beg me on your knees for the privilege of eating slop with the other animals. And when you finally break, and you will break, they always do, I want you to remember this moment when you thought you were a hero." After Marshall and his guards left, slamming the door with a finality that echoed through the concrete chamber, Ibrahim sat in the renewed darkness and made a decision that would change everything. He would not just survive this ordeal, he would use it to transform himself into something more dangerous than Marshall could imagine. Every moment of suffering would be converted into resolve, every hour of hunger into determination, every instant of pain into fuel for the justice that was coming. By the 5th day in solitary confinement, Ibrahim's physical condition had deteriorated significantly. The lack of food and water was beginning to affect his coordination and clarity of thought. His lips were cracked and bleeding, his hands shook with weakness, and dark spots danced at the edges of his vision. But on this day something unprecedented happened. Late at night, when the prison had settled into its routine of quiet horror, Ibrahim heard the soft scraping of metal against metal. The sound was so quiet that at first he thought he might be hallucinating, but it continued with the steady rhythm of someone working with careful precision. A small section of the concrete wall near the floor began to move. Ibrahim watched in amazement as a block of concrete no larger than a book was carefully pushed inward, creating an opening barely big enough for a man's arm to fit through. From this opening, a voice whispered in French so quiet it was barely audible, "Brother, are you awake?" "My name is Mamadou. I work in the kitchen. The whole prison is talking about the man who stood up to Marshall." A dark hand appeared through the opening holding a small container of water and a piece of bread. "The prisoners sent me to find you." Ibrahim took the food and water with hands that trembled with more than just weakness. They trembled with the recognition that he was not alone, that his act of defiance had created ripples that were spreading through the prison like cracks in a dam. "How did you find me?" Ibrahim asked, after drinking the precious water. "We have our ways," Mamadou replied. "This prison was built on an old foundation. There are tunnels and passages that the guards don't know about. We use them to help prisoners survive, to share information, to give hope to those who have given up." Over the next hour, speaking in whispers that wouldn't carry beyond the concrete chamber, Mamadou explained something that astonished Ibrahim. There was an entire network of prisoners and even some sympathetic guards who worked together to undermine the system of oppression from within. "We can't change everything," Mamadou explained, "but we can keep some people alive. We can share food, medicine when we can get it, information about which guards to avoid and which ones might show mercy. We've been doing this for years." "Why?" Ibrahim asked. "Why risk your lives for other prisoners?" There was a long pause before Mamadou answered, and when he spoke, his voice carried a weight of accumulated pain and determined hope. "Because if we don't maintain our humanity in here, they win completely. If we let this place turn us into the animals they claim we are, then we become accomplices in our own destruction." This revelation changed everything for Ibrahim. He had come here expecting to find only victims and victimizers, but instead he was discovering something more complex, a hidden community of resistance, people who had found ways to maintain dignity and mutual aid even in the midst of systematic dehumanization. "There's something else," Mamadou whispered. "We've been watching you. The way you carry yourself, the way you speak. You're not like the others. You're educated. You understand things about the world outside. Some of us think you might be more than you appear to be." Ibrahim's heart began beating faster. If his identity was discovered now, everything would be ruined. "I'm just another prisoner," he said carefully. "Maybe," Mamadou replied, but his tone suggested he wasn't convinced. "But whoever you are, your words yesterday have given people hope, and hope is the most dangerous thing we can smuggle into this place." For the next 3 nights, Mamadou continued to visit, bringing small amounts of food and water that kept Ibrahim alive, and more importantly, bringing news from the rest of the prison. The story of the prisoner who had stood up to Marshall was spreading and growing, becoming legend with each retelling. Some prisoners were saying that the man had supernatural strength, that Marshall's blows had bounced off him like he was made of iron. Others claimed he had spoken prophecies about the day when justice would come to Murden prison. Still others believed he was a lawyer or journalist who had come to expose their conditions. "Truth doesn't matter as much as what truth becomes," Mamadou explained. "People need to believe that someone is fighting for them, that they haven't been completely forgotten by the world outside." On the 7th day, just as Ibrahim was beginning to wonder if Marshall intended to leave him in solitary confinement until he died, the door burst open with a violence that sent echoes bouncing off the concrete walls. Marshall stood there with 4 guards, his face twisted with frustration and something that might have been fear. "Get up, monkey," Marshall snarled. "Time to rejoin your friends. But don't think this means you've won anything. This is just the beginning of your education in respect." As they dragged Ibrahim from the cell, he realized that something fundamental had changed. The guards' grip on his arms was tighter than before, their glances at each other more nervous. Marshall's bravado seemed forced, as if he were trying to convince himself as much as anyone else that he remained in control. The reason became clear as they emerged into the main prison compound. Everywhere Ibrahim looked, he saw prisoners standing a little straighter, making eye contact with each other and with the guards, moving with something that hadn't been there before: dignity. Word of the underground network, of Mamadou's visits, of the growing legend of the prisoner who wouldn't break had spread through the entire population. The seed of resistance that Ibrahim had planted with his confrontation was beginning to grow into something larger and more dangerous than one man's defiance. As they approached cell block C, Ibrahim realized that his mission had evolved beyond simply gathering evidence. He had become a symbol, a catalyst for change that was already beginning to transform the prison from within. The real revolution was about to begin. Ibrahim's return to cell block C was met with a silence that spoke louder than any cheering could have. The other prisoners looked at him with eyes that held something new. Not just respect, but recognition. They saw in his steady walk, despite 7 days of starvation and abuse, proof that the human spirit could not be completely broken by any system, no matter how cruel or comprehensive. Khalid, the young man who had tended to Abdul in his final moments, approached Ibrahim with tears streaming down his face. "Brother," he said, his voice choked with emotion, "we thought you had killed you." It takes more than Marshall and his dogs to kill hope. Word of his survival and defiance had spread beyond cell block C, beyond even the black prisoners' sections. The entire prison was buzzing with whispered conversations about the man who had looked Marshall in the eye and refused to break. Stories were being passed from cell to cell, growing with each telling, becoming the kind of legend that sustains people through the darkest times. But Ibrahim soon learned that his week in solitary confinement had cost more than just his physical strength. During his absence, 3 more prisoners had died, 2 from illness that could have been easily treated with basic medical care, and 1 from what the guards claimed was suicide, but what the prisoners knew was murder. "They're killing us faster now," explained Barr, the elderly teacher whose wisdom had become a source of comfort for many of the younger prisoners. "Ever since your confrontation with Marshall, they've been more vicious, more deliberate in their cruelty. They're afraid of what you've started." That night, as the prison settled into its routine of supervised suffering, Ibrahim made a decision that would change the course of everything that followed. Using hand signals and whispered words passed from prisoner to prisoner, he sent a message through Mamadou's network. He wanted to meet with the leaders of the underground resistance. 2 days later, in the darkness of the early morning hours when most guards were either asleep or drunk, Ibrahim found himself being led through passages he never would have imagined existed. Behind false walls, through maintenance tunnels, down corridors that had been forgotten by the official blueprints, he was taken to a hidden room in the basement of the prison. There, by the light of a single candle that cast dancing shadows on the walls, he met with 5 men who represented different sections of the prison population. They were the organizers, the ones who had spent years building networks of mutual aid and resistance within the system designed to crush them completely. "We know you're not who you claim to be," said their leader, an older man named Sekou, whose intelligence shone from eyes that had seen too much but refused to surrender to despair. Ibrahim looked at each of them in turn, weighing his options. Revealing his identity would either galvanize their movement or destroy it completely if word reached the wrong ears. But looking into their faces, seeing the commitment and courage that had sustained their resistance for years, he made his choice. "My name is Ibrahim Traore," he said quietly. "I am the president of Burkina Faso." The silence that followed was so complete that the sound of their breathing seemed loud in the confined space. Then, one by one, understanding dawned in their eyes. Not just surprise, but a recognition of the incredible opportunity that had just presented itself. "You came here deliberately," Sekou said, his voice filled with awe. "You chose to experience this hell so you could understand it completely." "And now you know," added another man, "that this isn't just a prison. It's a machine designed to destroy people based on the color of their skin, their economic status, their ability to defend themselves in a system rigged against them." Ibrahim nodded, but knowing is only the first step. The question is, what are we going to do about it? Over the next 2 hours, by candlelight in a hidden room beneath the earth, the president of Burkina Faso and 5 prisoners planned nothing less than the complete transformation of their nation's justice system. They discussed evidence that needed to be gathered, testimonies that needed to be preserved, connections to the outside world that needed to be established. But more than that, they planned how to sustain the spark of hope and resistance that was already spreading through the prison population. They discussed ways to protect the most vulnerable prisoners, to document every abuse, to create a record that could never be denied or suppressed. "When you leave here," Sekou said, as their meeting drew to a close, "you'll return to a world of power and privilege. It would be easy to forget what you've seen here, to let the comfort of your office wash away the memory of this suffering." Ibrahim looked at each of them in turn, these heroes who had maintained their humanity in circumstances designed to destroy it, who had risked everything to help others when helping meant potentially sacrificing their own survival. "I will never forget,"
he said, and in his voice was the iron promise of a man who had looked into the depths of systematic evil and emerged with his moral vision not just intact, but purified by fire. And more than that, I will make sure the world never forgets. As he was led back through the secret passages to cell block C, Ibrahim carried with him more than just the memory of this meeting. He carried the hopes and dreams of every person who had ever been broken by the system he was about to dismantle, the voices of everyone who had died in silence and darkness, the trust of those who had found ways to maintain love and dignity even in hell. The revolution was no longer coming, it had already begun, sparked by one man's refusal to remain silent in the face of injustice, sustained by a network of heroes whose names would never appear in history books but whose courage would transform a nation. The hardest part of his mission was behind him. Now came the even more difficult task, returning to the world of power and using that power to honor the trust of those who had none. 3 weeks after Ibrahim's meeting with the underground resistance, something unprecedented happened at Murden Prison. It began with a routine inspection that was anything but routine. A surprise visit by officials from the capital who arrived without the usual advance notice that allowed administrators to hide their crimes behind temporary improvements.
What they found was a powder keg of tension ready to explode. The prisoners, inspired by the legend of the man who had stood up to Marshall, were no longer the broken, submissive population the system required for its smooth operation. They walked with their heads higher, looked guards in the eye, and most dangerously of all, they had begun to speak to each other across the racial divides that had previously kept them isolated and powerless. Marshall and his guards had responded to this subtle rebellion with increased violence, more arbitrary punishments, and a reign of terror designed to crush the emerging spirit of resistance. But instead of breaking the prisoners' newfound courage, the additional cruelty had only solidified their unity. On the morning that would later be remembered as the day everything changed, the tension finally erupted. It started with something small. A white prisoner named Michael who had been watching the systematic abuse of black prisoners with growing disgust. When he saw a guard strike an elderly black man for moving too slowly to the food line, something inside him snapped. "That's enough!" Michael shouted, stepping forward to place himself between the guard and the elderly prisoner. "He's done nothing wrong!" The guard, shocked by this unprecedented breach of the prison's racial order, raised his baton to strike Michael. But before the blow could land, 2 other prisoners, one black, one white, stepped forward to stand beside Michael. Within minutes, what had started as one man's act of conscience had become something much larger. Prisoners throughout the courtyard were rising to their feet, moving toward the confrontation, their faces showing not fear, but determination. Marshall arrived with reinforcements, expecting to quickly crush this minor disturbance. Instead, he found himself facing something he had never encountered in 20 years of systematic oppression, a prison population that had learned to see each other as human beings rather than competitors for survival. "Get back to your cells!" Marshall screamed, his voice cracking with panic. "All of you, now!" But nobody moved. They stood together, black and white, young and old, thieves and political prisoners and victims of circumstance, united by their shared experience of suffering and their newfound refusal to accept that suffering as inevitable. In the center of this crowd, Ibrahim felt history turning like a wheel. This was the moment he had been working toward without realizing it. The transformation that proved systematic oppression could be overcome when people refused to accept the divisions imposed upon them by their oppressors. As tensions reached a breaking point and Marshall's guards raised their weapons, Ibrahim made a decision that would forever change his life and the life of his nation. He stepped forward, out of the crowd, and spoke in a voice that carried across the entire courtyard. "My name is Ibrahim Traore, and I am the president of Burkina Faso. I have been here for 3 weeks, witnessing crimes against humanity that will not be unpunished." The silence that followed was absolute. Guards lowered their weapons in shock. Prisoners stared in amazement, and Marshall's face went through a transformation that would have been comical if the situation had been less serious. From rage to confusion to dawning horror as he realized the implications of what he had just heard. Within hours, the prison was surrounded by government officials, journalists, and international observers. The story of a president who had gone undercover in his own nation's most notorious prison exploded across global media, forcing a spotlight on conditions that had been hidden in darkness for decades. Marshall and dozens of his guards were arrested on charges ranging from murder to systematic human rights violations. The entire administrative structure of Murden Prison was dismantled and replaced. But more importantly, Ibrahim's evidence sparked a complete reformation of Burkina Faso's justice system, with new laws requiring transparency, accountability, and basic human dignity for all prisoners, regardless of race or economic status. 1 year later, the building that had once been Murden Prison had been transformed into something unprecedented in the history of criminal justice. A rehabilitation center based on the principles of human dignity, mutual respect, and genuine reform. The cells that had once been chambers of horror now housed educational programs, job training workshops, and counseling services designed to address the root causes of crime rather than simply punishing its symptoms. The courtyard where prisoners had once been segregated by race now hosted community meetings where inmates and staff worked together to continually improve the facility. But perhaps the most significant change was symbolic. Over the main entrance, where a sign had once proclaimed this to be a place of punishment, new words were carved in stone: "The House of Dignity, where justice and redemption meet." Ibrahim stood in that courtyard on the anniversary of his infiltration, surrounded by men who had once been prisoners and were now teachers, counselors, and advocates for criminal justice reform. Khalid had become a youth outreach coordinator, working to prevent at-risk young people from entering the system in the first place. Sekou had been appointed as the facility's director, bringing his years of underground organizing experience to bear on the challenge of creating genuine rehabilitation. Even some of the former guards had stayed on after extensive retraining and psychological counseling, committed to redemption rather than revenge, understanding rather than hatred. "What you did here," Sekou said to Ibrahim as they watched a group of former inmates teaching literacy classes to current residents, "wasn't just about exposing one prison's crimes. You proved that transformation is possible, that people aren't disposable, that justice is about healing rather than harm." Ibrahim nodded, but his eyes were fixed on a memorial wall that had been erected in the center of the courtyard. On it were carved the names of everyone who had died in Murden Prison during the years of systematic abuse, including Abdul, whose death had been the catalyst for Ibrahim's transformation from observer to revolutionary. "They weren't forgotten," Ibrahim said quietly. "Their deaths meant something. They became the foundation for something better." As the sun set over the mountains that surrounded what was now called the House of Dignity, Ibrahim reflected on the journey that had brought him from the comfort of presidential palaces to the hell of systematic oppression and finally to this place of hope and transformation. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about the power to command from above, but about the courage to stand beside those who suffered, to share their pain, and to transform that shared experience into a force for justice that could change the world. the House of Dignity became a model that was copied throughout Africa and beyond, proving that even the most entrenched systems of oppression could be transformed when people refused to accept cruelty as inevitable and chose instead to build something better on the foundation of shared humanity. And in the hidden room that had once been a meeting place for the underground resistance, now converted into a memorial to the power of hope in the darkest places, visitors could read the words that had become the motto of the new system of justice. When we refuse to see each other as enemies, when we insist on recognizing the dignity that exists in every human soul, and when we transform our pain into purpose and our suffering into solidarity, that is when justice stops being a dream and becomes a reality that transforms the world. The revolution that began with one man's refusal to remain silent became something larger than anyone could have imagined. Proof that love is stronger than hate, that dignity is more powerful than oppression, and that the human spirit, when united in purpose, can overcome any system designed to destroy it. In the end, the House of Dignity stood as more than just a reformed prison. It stood as testimony to the truth that every person, no matter how broken or forgotten, carries within them the potential for redemption, transformation, and hope.